So, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Frontline online monthly book night, and welcome to those of you who are with us for the first time. This book club, Pranvera Smith's brilliant and very special idea, is a little different because with this book club, you can meet the author. And it's a club that is not dependent on talking about just newly published books, but also about ones we've been wanting to read for some time or which we have read and love so much we want to share. Our authors have included Louis de Bernier, Elif Shafak, Kegi Carew, Amanda Craig, John Simpson, Philippe Sands, and Michael Vatikiotis. And tonight we're going to chat with James Hanning about his latest book, Love and Deception, Philby in Beirut. The highly praised Love and Deception, Philby in Beirut, which has as its starting point the notorious British traitor Kim Philby as lover, thus the title, and in particular his marriage to Eleanor Brewer, née Kearns, an American woman previously married to New York Times correspondent Sam Brewer, who had been posted to the Middle East as their correspondent. As Philby, who was also married, albeit to a woman he left behind in England, had been sent to the region for The Observer and The Economist. So much has been written about Philby, so infamous he is known simply by his surname. It does beg the question, what more could be said and why? Indeed, I have been asked that when I've told a few people that I was interviewing James for this book. But given how controversial and far-reaching the act of treachery is, it is likewise, I believe in this instance, useful to sift, to see what revelations might come to light and add nuance to the story. Also, new works like this are of their time and can be more critical and perhaps also more objective of those players, good and bad, involved in the scandal. It is clear from reading this book how comprehensively James understands the story, that this book is a kind of passion project for him, one that has been under his skin for at least 20 years, and which maybe James, you can tell us later, he turned to as a kind of hobbyist sleuth, albeit one with remarkable credentials and provenance. For those of you in the audience who don't know James, I'll give you a little potted bio. James has a master's in West European politics from the LSE, and he spent several years living abroad, preparing a doctoral thesis on Italian politics before starting a career in journalism. Initially, he worked as a freelancer before joining or moving to the Evening Standard. Under Max Hastings, he rose to become associate editor with responsibility for the comment pages. In 2004, he moved to The Independent on Sunday and was latterly the paper's deputy editor. Feather in his cap, James secured the exclusive collaboration of News of the World investigator Glenn Mulcair for an expose of the phone hacking scandal. And James is also David Cameron's co-biographer, along with Francis Eliot. James, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. I understand you're in Wales now.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, great to be here. Great to be here. Yeah, in sunny Wales, I'm pleased to say.
Good. Well, we spoke yesterday and you were climbing up a mountain, spoke just briefly. So look, the format is we'll begin as usual with a few questions back and forth, but I do encourage our audience, please, to participate by using the chat box with comments and queries I'll feed into our discussion. I understand from James, especially, that a few of you are more, really familiar with the story, as I was not really, and have some maybe tenuous connection to the story yourselves. So I would be very interested to hear to share your comments and to hear your questions for James. And because I don't read a lot of this genre, sort of spy nonfiction, but I am interested in it. I'm a former Korean linguist who served in the US military at Fort Meade. I do have some, I am pretty well informed, if you wouldn't mind me saying. And so, but I am coming at this as a punter. So I don't know the story well. So I might ask questions that other people might be too embarrassed to ask, but are really simple questions that I'll ask for us. So my first question, James, is as above. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who will have asked you, why yet another book on Philby?
Well, a couple of things. One is that I I've always been interested in this world, and I particularly originally in Anthony Blunt, and the more I looked into Anthony Blunt's history, his story, I felt that they overlapped more than had been commonly supposed with that of Philby. Most people associate Burgess and MacLean as a sort of couple, and Philby was a kind of loner, and Blunt was a kind of loner. But actually, by the early 60s, Blunt and Philby were quite close. And I thought, well, that's quite an interesting relationship. And I then looked more and more into the circumstances of Philby's disappearance, and got very interested in the human story of Philby's wife, who, if those who've read the book will know, they arranged to go to a dinner party. Philby said, "I'm sorry, I'll be a bit late." And the next thing she knew of him for certain was that he turned up in Moscow 6 months later. So it's a fairly extraordinary human story. And so, of course, like most people, I thought, oh, she must have known something, blah, 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 blah. And so I got more and more intrigued in that. And then by all that. And then I thought, well, nobody's really got to the bottom of this. So I started asking questions, and somebody who was a colleague at the Evening Standard was Brian Sewell, who knew Anthony Blunt very well. And so I asked him if he could shed any light on this. And in fact, this rather intimidating figure turned out to be very nice and actually very helpful. And there were certain things about the story that he didn't want to write himself, but he said he would help me with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, speaking of Sewell, I mean, he's one of the characters, well, kind of characters that you mentioned, one of the names that you mentioned in this book. I mean, there's so many names in this book. I was sort of struggling to get a handle on them, and keep track of them. But I suppose this reflects the large pool of associates milling around at that time. As with any journalist, spy, and as with any journalist spy, it is a given that the more contacts you have, the better. And this is reflected in the names you mentioned here. And also, as with any work of fiction and or non-fiction, the rule is to introduce characters only if they compel the story forward. And it seems in this case that so many people did, with Philby in many ways, influence or touch on the arc of his life, for better or for worse, as he touched theirs. You mentioned, to name but a few, Freya Stark, Claire Hollingsworth, the infamous or the famous Claire Hollingsworth, Victor Rothschild, Stephen Spender, Flora Solomon, Nicholas Elliott, of course, Myrtle Winter, Ian Fleming, MacLean, Burgess, Blunt, the art critic, as we said, Brian Sewell, Patrick Searle, and others. And in that very British way, you all then tell us often who they are related to. There's a saying we have in America, where I'm from. In New York, it's who you know. In Boston, it's what you know, and in Philadelphia, it's what your mother's maiden name. And I found that kind of filtered its way, what your mother's maiden name filtered its way through to here, because this is a book about about society, isn't it? And what Amanda Foreman says, if there were ever a cautionary tale about the true cost of male privilege in the higher echelons of the British establishment, this is it. Hanning's masterful research lays bare the extraordinary hypocrisy that enabled Kim Philby to lie and trick his way through life. So tell us, were there characters you left out? How did you decide who to mention?
Yes, there were a lot of rabbit holes I went down and thought, gosh, I would really like to nail that one, and I just had to leave them out. But there were some people like the British ambassador in Beirut, Ponsonby Moore Crosswaite, Sir Ponsonby Moore Crosswaite, who is an extraordinary character, who was a great friend of Anthony Blunt, and was actually a key to something that seems to me very important for the whole story. And he, it turned out, he was very useful to Blunt, and Blunt, of course, had been at school with him. Anyway, they were friends they had friends in common and so on. And it was a very small circle of people who, and somebody knew somebody, and somebody would have a word with somebody and get them into the security services or whatever. And it was, and people were forever bumping into each other in White's, the club in central London. So it was just everybody knew everybody, and everybody was looking after everybody and being terribly nice and so on and so on. And I think the Americans particularly were absolutely horrified by this sort of network of sort of comfortable complacency.
I mean, isn't that, there's the famous story of the lunch at White's, wasn't it? Where was it Philby's father, St. John Philby, who said, "Oh, you know, it was a folly of his youth that he was involved in communism." Is this the?
Yes, that's right. Philby went to Kim Philby went to the loo, and the person who was interviewing Kim sort of said, "Well, I've heard he might have been a communist at university." And St. John Philby, this eminent Arabist, sort of said, "Oh no, that was just a youthful enthusiasm. He's over all that." And it was, "Oh, that's all right then. Let him in. You know, fine." And he was waved through. It was extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, considering what kind of vetting goes on now, right? For the security services, etc. You know, security clearances and whatnot. I mean, I suppose that's partly because of the likes of Philby and others. And they can do now with, you know, computers, and we have better spycraft, I suppose, in terms of filtering people in and out, but still it happens. But look, so speaking of all the characters in the book, and we have a question from Chris Hoff. I don't know how to say your surname, but I'll filter that through. But and I'll filter other questions through. But just give me a moment, give us a few minutes, and then we'll weave them in. So I want to, speaking of, you know, all these, given the focus of this book on Philby's love affairs and his charm, I mean, you really make out how, you know, charming he was both to women and men, and this was, you know, a successful part of his subterfuge. I think we have to mention again his father, St. John Philby, one of the most famous Arabists of his generation, yet famous also for his arrogance and irascibility. One of my own authors, Michael Vitikiotis, whose own father, PJ, was a scholar, an eminent scholar of the Middle East, at one point worked for St. John, and it was a really uncomfortable arrangement with a man who today would be labeled, you know, as a bully, perhaps, but whose own love life was an example, as ever, to his son. You write on page 328, I forgot to mention this to you in the prelude, that I might want you to read something. I don't know if you have the book there with you.
328.
Page 328, a feeling in common in Beirut was that Philby's lack of loyalty to Britain. That's just the last paragraph. Would you just read that out? Or maybe that paragraph, yeah?
Yeah, a feeling common in Beirut was that Philby's lack of loyalty to Britain had come from his father, but then so did his lack of conventional beliefs of any sort. He was brought up with few of the handrails, love of country, class, church, profession, locality, that for better or worse customarily guided public school boys through life. Resenting his father, he had to find his own bearings. He also lacked the sort of moral cutout that usually prevents the squeamish middle classes from scandalizing their peers in matters big and small, though he was more skilled at mitigation. Where St. John, the wicket-keeper, would cheat at cricket or report a pilot for flying too close to Mecca or plot to damage British oil interests or endorse fascism, Kim would father children out of wedlock, pinch women's bottoms, and rat on those who thought he was a friend, and all with something he did inherit, St. John's sense of unassailability.
I think that's, just leave it at that. I mean, this is what I found really, the unassailability, the sort of confidence, arrogance, whatever. The other thing that he took away from St. John was, you know, this idea of polygamy, you know, which at one point he thought he might mimic, right, with suggesting to Eleanor that he and Melinda McLean might set up house together, with Eleanor as the kind of lowly second bird keeper, as it were. And Le Carre, as you note in here, says that Philby lived his life from bed to bed. I mean, what I got from this, he did. I mean, he was just having he was a serial monogamist, correct?
Well, yes. I mean, there is a debate about this. He certainly liked the company of women. If that doesn't sound too euphemistic, I mean, he did. Whether he was kind of habitually unfaithful to all the women, for all his wives, at an early stage in their relationship. I'm not certain. I know lots of people. I mean, plenty of people are inclined to kind of paint Kim as even blacker than he was, it seems to me. And they said, oh, he was all, and when he went missing, they said, oh, he must have been off with a girlfriend or something. Well, I don't know what evidence there is for that. I think my own feeling is that actually he did a lot of bottom pinching, which was less disapproved of now then than it would be now. And it was kind of, still Kim, who isn't, it's all such, it's a jolly jape.
I'm sure he wasn't the only one.
No, exactly. No, that was, I mean, that was kind of what went on a lot. But I think he tended to move on in his relationship, in his monogamous relationships. He kind of tended to get a bit bored and then moved on, and kind of de facto these relationships were over. But it generally was him who decided that they were over rather than the women.
So, I mean, speaking of the women and his jumping from bed to bed, as it were, let's talk about Eleanor, because she, her story sort of partly inspired the writing of this book, I suppose, as you had said. And Eleanor, I found a sort of fascinating and sort of sad character. Ultimately, she was a middle to upper middle class American woman whose family were well off enough and liberated enough to send their daughter to university, which was unusual at the time and a privilege reserved for those with enough money. She was a bright woman and confident enough to be adventurous. No one without half a brain would be attractive to the journalist set. Conversation and stimulation is worth so much, intellectual stimulation and otherwise, and she would have had to hold her own, as she did. But it's clear that she was a victim both of Philby's utter lack of loyalty to anyone or anything but his fantastic idealism, but also a victim of her time, when upon marriage, the game was really up for her. So tell us a little bit about Eleanor and her background, this middle-class Irish American who grew up in Spokane, Washington State, but who found herself eventually at the epicenter of one of the greatest spy scandals in history.
Yeah, well, that's right. She went to University of Washington in Washington State, and was promoted in a succession of jobs. Always did very well. Was quite artistically minded. She studied actually with Diego Rivera at one point, and she was very good at. I mean, she earned a living. She got to earn a living quite early in life. She progressed. She went to work in San Francisco, and then when the war started, she was her artistic leanings were put to good use in putting together posters, sort of war Ministry of Information type posters, and civil defense posters and that kind of thing. And she was very highly rated in doing that, and very good at that kind of public service stuff, and kind of making what could be quite routine, mundane stuff, making it interesting, making it grabby, so people actually bothered to read it, which is quite a skill. And then she was always anxious to move, and she wanted to see Europe, and she moved across to Europe during the war, and was in Turkey actually, which was neutral, where she did some work for the American Foreign Service. It's not. One of my frustrations was that I wasn't able to identify exactly what she did. But she did a lot of cultural things late in the war, and then after the war in the reconstruction of Germany, which was again suited her very well. She was very, very capable and got around, and as you say, sort of pretty fearless, and held her own. And in Turkey, she met Sam Brewer, who she married, who was this. I don't know if you'd say dashing. I mean, he became quite a I suppose a stodgy figure, but he was considered a journalist with great promise, and I think would probably have been thought quite a catch, actually, again, to use perhaps a not particularly appropriate phrase, but it seemed she was going to then settle down and do the homemaking thing that was expected of her. And indeed they had a child in the late 40s, and moved around a bit, went to Latin America, and then to Beirut.
And that's where she met Philby. And they fell in love, had a love affair, fairly open, because it was this small sort of set of, this was post-war as well. I reckon people felt a little bit liberated, having lived through what they did and survived, and were sort of traumatized by the war. I suppose they might have been a little bit more open-minded at that time in terms of, or more sexually liberated, perhaps. Or maybe it was the sort of British upper class thing where it's seen but not heard, seen but not heard. Everybody kind of understood what was going on, but as long as you stayed married and pretended that maintained the facade. But eventually they fell so much in love, Philby seemed to really fall for her, and likewise that they just they divorced each other's respective spouses, or they divorced to marry each other.
Well, that's right. I mean, Sam, her husband, was her first husband, was obsessed with work, and I mean, quite a forbidding figure, I think, and she wasn't really getting a great deal out of that relationship. And Philby was married to Aileen, who was back in England with their children. And he pitched up in Beirut, and was a kind of, slightly a little boy lost, although his father was there, who introduced to all these people. But I suspect he played on that, and Eleanor was interested in him, this slightly mysterious figure. And they just fell madly in love within weeks of Philby arriving. It was quite extraordinary. And Eleanor had actually been asked by Sam to go and meet Kim at the St. George's Hotel, because Sam and Philby had known each other during the Spanish Civil War, and indeed in the States subsequently. So it was Sam who sort of inadvertently put them together, as it were.
So, when Philby went to Beirut, wasn't there even at that time initially a kind of whiff of scandal about, or whiff of something, and people weren't sure that maybe he could have been a spy? Isn't that correct? So he was sort of in Beirut to be watched and to rehabilitate his reputation, because he was exonerated.
Well, that's right. He had been exonerated by the British government in 1955. They'd been forced to take a position. They were very suspicious of him, and he was named in the House of Commons, which meant that the government then had to take a position. And because they couldn't prove he was a Russian spy, although a lot of them believed it, or some of them believed it, they had to clear him. And then his friends all said, well, if he's an innocent man, we've got to find him a job. So he was found in this best of British ways. He was found a job in his old profession of journalism, also doing work for MI6 on the side in Beirut. He was also sent to Beirut for two other reasons. One, to get him out of the way, because if it did go wrong, they didn't want him causing a stink in London. And secondly, because his father was so well connected, and they wanted to know what was going on the British wanted to know what was going on in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East more generally. And he would be very useful there. He was just very good at assimilating information and great powers of analysis and so on.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall with you, sitting at a table with others, historians, journalists, psychologists, perhaps, who've studied the Philby phenomenon. It would be a lively conversation, not without its own controversy. But I was thinking Philby must be smiling from the grave, knowing that we were all still talking about him, writing about him, etc. And in many ways, the fact that we continue to talk about Philby, the son, keeps the memory of Philby, the father, alive also, when there were other greater and more admirable Arabists and scholars, as with P.J. Vaticiotis. Why does this country maintain its fascination, turning and returning our otherwise valuable attention to this pair of narcissists?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think one of the things that strikes me in the whole Philby story is that everybody, including actually the Russians and Eleanor, everybody underestimated the extent of his ideological commitment and his I would say idealism. He really, really believed, and he went, and for a man, so, you know, who a lot of people write off as a cynic, I think that's, I hesitate to say unfair, but I think he did believe, he did sign up. I think in that respect, he was sincere. He signed up in the 30s and he thought the world could be a much better place, and he believed in that, in the communist dream. And the British, who are so pragmatic and liberal, and so I think Stalin once said if you tried communism in Britain, it would be like putting a saddle on a cow. The British just don't do that stuff. They don't do ideology and doctrine and dogma and so on. It's all pragmatism and liberalism and individualism. So people just couldn't understand that. So Philby really stood out in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, Snowden said, as you write in the book, that Philby, quote, was not necessarily a bad man per se, but he was a traitor by accident of birth, traitors being their own kind of foot soldiers who leave so many casualties in their wake. And I'm afraid, James, I'm kind of rather of the mindset of Rebecca West when it comes to my opinion of treachery. What has always struck me about zealots is that is their idealistic passion, and the fact that they have convinced themselves of their notion to, you know, that they're doing good and they're going to change the world.
Yeah.
It is a kind of, again, narcissism, though in many ways Philby and others like him, I think, are no better than sort of suicide bombers. He may as well have strapped himself, you know, with a vest full of dynamite, given the carnage he left behind. But in terms of, you know, casualties, victims, certainly Eleanor should be included amongst them, as should Aileen, his first wife. His treatment of her is simply appalling, but, you know, not surprising given his apparent ability to detach himself emotionally. I suppose in Victorian times, he would have had her locked up in an insane asylum, the proverbial woman in the attic. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. It's an extraordinary conceit. It's an amazing conceit. And I certainly don't want to be anybody to think I'm an apologist for Philby. All I have been trying to do really is to understand. I mean, to understand is not to excuse. I just think in some of the books I've read about him, that people are so anxious to give him a kicking, and there are lots of things that he was supposed to have done that actually he didn't do. Nigel West is very interesting on this. He just, you know, some of the things that led at his door, he couldn't have done. But that's not to excuse the terrible things he did do. But essentially, I just think it's quite interesting to try and understand why he did what he did. It's not, I mean, when we talk about Adolf Hitler, we don't get angry. We want to understand and think, well, actually, maybe Philby's entitled to that as well. And I don't want, you know, I'm not defending, you know, the appalling things that went on in Albania and so on. I mean, not
no,
really.
I understand. So look, let me bring some questions in. Chris Hoff, please pardon my pronunciation of everybody's surname. So it says there's a sense reading this book that the West had spies in the KGB and the USSR had spies in the West, including Philby. Did they cancel each other out and lead to a sort of clandestine openness? Can you point to any real harm caused by Philby's spying?
Well, yes. I mean, he sent people back to their deaths, for example, and I mean, some of the emigres who came, the anti-communists who came to. I mean, people died. There is no doubt about that. I mean, I haven't got into how many people died as a result of what he did. I did ask Michael Smith, who's one of the serious Philby experts. I don't call myself a serious Philby expert, but I'm, you know, very interested in this particular period. But he said you can't calculate it. We just don't know. But many people died, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. On the more general point about spies, cancelling each other out, I mean, I think there's something in that. There's quite a lot in that, and people like one of the former heads of MI6 said as much, that we were just cancelling each other out. But neither side was gonna stop playing the game, because they couldn't afford to, because then serious damage would have been done to national interests, to their own national interests.
I've got a question here that kind of dovetails with one of mine, or a comment. I mean, another one of the great things about your book is the atmosphere that you create, and you tell us about, Beirut during this period, and Hotel Normandy, Harry's Bar, St. George's, all these watering holes, with these sort of unofficial foreign correspondence clubs or just gentlemen's clubs in Beirut. It's astonishing to me, as well as someone in publishing who had to learn to hold my drink, the capacity for alcoholic consumption during this period. But tell us a little bit more about Beirut at this time, and as another character in the book, as Leo Enright has said. Tell us about its importance geopolitically, and any thoughts about, Leo asks any thoughts about the city then and now. But my question is, tell us a little bit about Beirut at the time and its importance then geopolitically.
Yeah, well, kind of culturally, it was a very relaxed place to be, and in those kind of in mid to late 50s, there was, as we all know, a lot of concern about what was going on in Egypt, and a lot of companies, media outfits, spies were kind of shifting from Cairo to Beirut, and it was a very easy place to live. I mean, Stuart Copeland, the drummer, the Police drummer, whose father was a great friend of Philby's, or at least thought he was. He talks about how he, young boy, used to just get taxis all around town on his own, at the age of 10 or 11 or whatever. It was a kind of blissful, very happy place, palm trees, French restaurants, just very relaxed, and lots of British, American, French diplomats very much enjoyed being there. The schools were good, the sun shone. It was a very agreeable place. And it was being backed by the US. It was kind of geopolitically safe. Syria less so, and I mean, I'm not an expert on what the Soviet expansionism at that time, but certainly the Americans felt that the Russians were expanding and making trouble there, and the Americans felt it was their duty to prop up Lebanon and indeed bring down governments in the area which didn't think the right things.
Yeah, I mean, I was astonished. I mean, as an American, I don't know why I'm astonished. I mean, I understand the way history works, but you're very open about how they fixed the election. I mean, it is hypocritical that the Americans are going on about Russian interference in our election, or our election, alleged interference or whatever. But here the Americans are taking literally bags of cash around to people to swing the election in somebody's favor. And I mean, they've been doing this for years and years and years and years and years, not just in Beirut, but elsewhere in the world.
Well, one of the people Philby did a lot of drinking with was a guy called Bill Evelyn, who was a CIA guy, though not acknowledged as such, but he clearly was. He used to get very indiscreet and talk to Philby, and so that was all getting back to the Russians. But Evelyn was the guy with the bags full of cash, paying the politicians.
So one of the other great revelations of this book is Anthony Blunt, and one of the key assertions you make is that he was the person who tipped off in Beirut, because when Philby disappeared over the border, it was from Beirut, much to Eleanor's surprise, and Blunt, although he denied it at the time, and subsequently he went to Beirut and met Philby to tip him off that his number was up and that he should get out. And tell us more. How did you find out about what made your mind up about it?
Yes, I mean, that's my belief. I hesitate to and in fact, we just scroll back a couple of paragraphs.
Okay.
Some people say Philby wasn't tipped off. Some people say, why would he be tipped off? Why did he hang about and wait to be confronted by the British if he'd been tipped off? I go into this at some length in the book. I think he felt he could afford to wait and see what the British were going to offer. And I'm not certain. I can't be certain, and I don't think anybody could ever be certain that Blunt actually tipped him off. That is my belief, though, and it's based on the fact that his host in Beirut was this chap, Sir Ponsonby Moore Crosswaite, who is the ambassador, who played host to Blunt. And Blunt did a very, very private visit to see Moore Crosswaite, and he denied that he'd done that. So 15 years later, when he was confronted. Now, if it is right that Blunt went to Beirut to tip off Philby, it would have been extraordinary for him to go completely secretly, because if somebody had said, well, why didn't you come and see your old friend Moore Crosswaite? What's going on? Have you come to see Philby? So he did this very kind of low-key, private, I'm going to see my old friend Moore, and he came up with it seems to me, he came up with a completely bogus excuse, which was that he was looking for an orchid, which is just bizarre. I mean, like
isn't it?
That's sort of Graham Greene sort of territory, it seems to me. Anyway, it was Brian Sewell who put me onto it. Brian Sewell said that when Blunt was asked about it, he lied. This was in 1981, I think, when it was put to him. He'd been to Beirut before, but the second trip was completely secret. And I spoke to the nieces of Moore Crosswaite, who confirmed how furious Moore Crosswaite was when he realized why he thought Blunt he realized that curious trip that Blunt made. I could never understand it. And
so was this the trip before Christmas? Because there were two trips, right? And some of the women who were interviewed after said, oh, we're sure he was here before Christmas. We're sure. And people were saying, oh, but no, he wasn't. And they said, no, but we're sure he was here before Christmas. And their memory or recollection was totally discounted. And now it comes to light that actually, he was there twice.
Well, he was there twice. He'd been there. It gets a bit complicated. He was there in Easter 61. And then 18 months later, that's what I've confirmed now, I think, in December 62. And that was just a few weeks before Philby disappeared. And it's my belief that he went, that's why he went. And the reason Blunt went was because somebody said, well, why didn't Blunt just tip off the Russians in London? He could have stayed in London, told the Russians that they were coming for Philby, and the Russians could have made arrangements in Beirut. I think the reason, if I'm right in this, I think the reason he would have done that is that he wanted Philby to have the choice. And he knew that if the Russians were in charge of the operation, they would have just put him in a bag and taken him off to Moscow. He wouldn't have had any choice. So he wanted to give Philby the opportunity of coming back to London or doing whatever. So he couldn't involve the Russians, and he had to go to Beirut himself.
And it was much better for the British establishment that he didn't return to London or even stay in, because they were embarrassed that they'd got it wrong the first time, and the Americans, were convinced that he was a spy. Right, and so it was a good way for the British to, get him off their plate, get rid of him, and then own up to the Americans, but yet not have to deal with him so much in situ. Correct? I mean,
well, there will be more Philby books, because somebody one day, I suspect, will prove either that Philby was indeed ushered towards the door by the British and they wanted him to go to Moscow, or conversely, they let him slip by mistake. They thought he was going to stay there and just cooperate and so on, and he just said, "Well, I'm off." So nobody really knows, the truth of whether they allowed him to go, or whether let him slip by mistake. But it is true, whatever, they would not have wanted a trial in London and so on. That would have been very embarrassing. And a lot of this, as you say, a lot of this was, they were trying to they were so embarrassed by the mistakes they'd made in the past. And the Americans had been saying, you know, we don't believe you. We think Philby is a Russian spy.
I mean, one of the aspects of the story, that one of the many aspects of the story that I found interesting is how many of his contemporaries were sort of complicit, and I do mean sort of. I mean, it's when you say that turning a blind eye is as egregious to being a willing accomplice. I mean, and is there any? You say, is there any room? Did you say this, or somebody you quote? Is there any room for synthesis between cock up and conspiracy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what still we don't know. Still, it's not clear. Nicholas Elliott, who was his great friend and defender for a very long time, who was the person who was sent to confront him. Apparently, he's written a memoir. His son told me, and there is his version of events, but we haven't been allowed to read that. One thing I would hope we might be told is whether indeed Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, whether he was complicit in the sending of Philby to Beirut, which is something I think I found in the book. He was, because a lot of the British spy establishment was saying, no, Philby, we don't, we shouldn't be sending Philby to Beirut. We should, he's a wrong un. And I've found very strong evidence that actually Harold Macmillan himself, as Foreign Secretary, said, no, we should send him, which is again another reason why for British embarrassment when he did eventually go in 63.
I mean, I don't think that he really, I mean, if he had gone over to the British side, or confessed or turned himself into the British and undergone a trial or whatever, I mean, I think his going to Moscow was a great act of self-preservation, because the Russians would have, assassinated him. He was a goner if he'd gone to the British and undergone the trial. I mean, it was just a fact of physical self-preservation. He had no choice. Really.
He would have been in huge danger had he done a deal. I mean, the British, as you know, the British wanted him to do an immunity deal, and which would have meant saying who the others were.
He'd be immune but dead, right? Later.
He what?
He'd be immune but dead. I mean, he would be assassinated.
Yeah, there's every chance. Exactly.
So questions here. Jamie Buxton, do you draw parallels between Philby's sexual infidelity and his political treachery? Or do you think his loyalty to communism meant this was the only thing he was ever true to? Good question.
Gosh, yes. I think he certainly was true to that. I mean, I think ultimately the reason I think he really wanted Eleanor to join him in Moscow. And he wanted that to work. And I think had Eleanor fitted in, I don't say she's actually culpable, but she had no interest in politics. She wasn't particularly interested in the Soviet Union. She wanted it to work, but she just was not. I mean, at one point he says, why are you so American? I mean, they both wanted it to work, but the fact was, it didn't work, and he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed in the eyes of his. I mean, he felt an embarrassment in front of the KGB that this woman was not fit, was not playing the game, and that I think is why he lost his devotion to her.
Well, I suppose they were kind of in a sort of lockdown, weren't they, at the time? They had nobody else really around them but the MacLeans to socialize with. Neither of them spoke Russian well enough. Eleanor was struggling with the language. Philby wasn't he wasn't a Russian speaker quite at that time. There was, they had to queue up for a loaf of bread, shortages all around. So it was far from the life of Riley, I suppose, that they were living in Beirut with, St. George's and the Normandy and all their mix of friends and bridge and alcohol. And so it was a lockdown, just the two of them together, a real hardship. And I suppose if you were Eleanor and had no real interest in, being in Moscow or in the Soviet Union, then it's a big ask, isn't it, on any relationship?
Yeah, and he was not trusted by the Russians. He expected to be put in charge of, the Britain desk or whatever it was. But they didn't. I mean, he didn't visit the KGB headquarters. I think apparently he visited it twice in about 20 years or so for very, menial matters. He just wasn't trusted fully, so he didn't get proper jobs.
And also, Eleanor had her daughter Annie with Sam Brewer, and Annie was used as a pawn by Sam I guess she was used as a pawn maybe to keep Eleanor away from Moscow, but also, he sued for what's the term? Not he had custody of Annie because for various reasons. And so Eleanor, who still loved her daughter deeply, and Annie seemed to really love her mother. So, there was that also keeping her away from the decision to stay for so long in Moscow, right? And this was, of course, before FaceTime and I think people forget how difficult. I mean, I remember coming to this country 26 years ago, and a phone call home to America, a 30-minute phone call would cost £50. And it was.
And it is. There is another remarkable thing, actually, just to go on that point about her assumption that she could just go backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, and they agreed to it. That is an extraordinary thing. In the context of how restrictive the Soviet Union was, and yet they did this deal, and she kind of thought, right, well, I'll do it then, and they were a bit surprised that she insisted on actually, demanding her side of the deal.
No, a lot of this book focuses on the sort of male friendships and the men looking after each other, as you noted earlier, and the strength of friendships and almost mafia-like, but notable also given that much of it is played out, as I said, during that post-war period when those who survived or witnessed the events would have had their outlook on life changed remarkably. But what I want to talk to you about now, James, quickly, is Eleanor's friends, in particular Susan Griggs, because as we noted, I mean, this book is, largely focused on Eleanor. She was a great victim. She really loved Philby. She was betrayed. The other woman wasn't Melinda McLean. It was Russia, right? The Soviet Union, and little did she know. And there she is, an abandoned woman and lost, in this world, and had nothing to tether herself to. Yet her female friends in particular, and she was living, as you said, from sofa to sofa, sobbing her eyes out, drinking herself into oblivion, and understandably, but her great friend, tell me about Susan Griggs, her great defender.
Well, yeah, one of the reasons I got a real sort of head of steam up actually on the book was talking to Susan, who is the daughter of the Fistiers, who were living in Beirut as part of the kind of American community in the late 50s and early 60s. John Fistier was doing kind of PR and teaching and so on, and they were a very gregarious lot. And Susan was growing up at that time in that sort of circle, and so she saw a lot of Philby, and she used to say, of course that guy can't be a double agent. I mean, nobody that drunk could possibly be a kind of super spy, because he was drunk every lunchtime, and then he'd go home and have a sleep, and then start all over again. And Susan witnessed all this, and she was one of the people who saw enough of Eleanor to really see what was admirable about her. A lot of people didn't really didn't find her on an initial meeting, particularly interesting character. And Kim was the charming one, and Kim was the sort of charismatic one, and she was slightly in the background. But Susan sort of said, no. People who knew Eleanor said she's very witty, very cultured, huge interest in archaeology and so on. She used to go off with Lorraine Copeland into the countryside in Lebanon and go on digs and watercoloring and so on. And she was a kind of very lively figure. I mean, she liked partying like Kim, but I slightly felt that she, in a lot of the spy books, she's kind of this, she's a mere spear carrier. She's a kind of a victim, a tragic victim figure and she was, of course, a victim, but not really deserving of much more interest than that. But actually, I think she would, and the fact that she was a kind of, if I can use this phrase, a person in her own right, and an interesting person, makes the story, it seems to me, makes the story all the more appalling, actually.
What happened to Sam Brewer and what happened to Annie Brewer? Where are they? I mean, Sam, obviously, he's dead, but what about Annie Brewer? And
well, yes, that's a very good question. She's still around, and lives in the States, and I've had kind of communication through third parties, and but she hasn't been particularly forthcoming. I sent them a copy of the book, and I had a nice note back, but I haven't, she's sort of moved on with her life.
Fiona Booths asks, foreign correspondents in the bars of Beirut were, you say, assets, agents or friends of the officers of the secret services there. Was this for the best, Fiona? Necessary? Would bags of money have changed hands?
Well, I think they were all trading information. When that's, I suppose, the risk of indulging in stereotypes. That's kind of what goes on in Lebanon, isn't it? And all over the world. And journalists want information, spies want information. Whether money changed hands, I don't think it would be as vulgar as that. But no, and Sam Brewer was Eleanor's first husband was when he joined the New York Times in 1945. He'd been with another paper, but he was considered to have had a good war, both as a journalist and also as a kind of asset. And when he joined the New York Times said, "We want, you've got to sever all your links with officialdom. We want you to be a journalist full time." And he said, "Yes, I will. Yes, I will." But I don't think many people believe that was, he didn't. One of his closest confidants was this guy Bill Evelyn, who was Philby, who was a CIA guy, and indeed on the day Burgess and McLean disappeared in 1951, the CIA got in touch with Sam Brewer and said, "Will you work for us full time?" And they wanted to second Sam for 2 years to help them nail Philby.
But he wasn't released, was he, from his job?
No, he wasn't. That's right. No, he wasn't. They didn't. No, the New York Times said, no, he's a journalist. He's a journalist. And he's one of those, I mean, he was, young journalists who are well connected are very well, very highly prized. Older journalists who are well connected tend to rely on rather too many official sources and, think, well, a couple of phone calls and that'll be enough. And they're over on official sources.
Here's a question that's been here for some time. I must get to it. Ewan Grant from London asks, did Brian Sewell ever suggest that Blunt, or indeed Philby, expressed regret about what either of them did, and he says thanks for the quote comfortable complacency comment.
Yes, well, actually, that's very interesting. I was actually listening to a tape I have of Brian Sewell the other day, who was saying how I don't know if people are or remember or are aware of the statement that Anthony Blunt read out when he was exposed in 1979. But it was written for him by Sir Robert Armstrong, the cabinet secretary. And Brian was saying it was obviously not written by Anthony. It was written. It was a kind of piece of officialese. And he said, I think his words were, "Had it been Anthony, there would have been a far greater expression of regret." And he said that Blunt went around sort of. The suggestion was that he went around saying, "How could I have been such an idiot?" And he was actually embarrassed, I think. I mean, Sewell said that Blunt was embarrassed by the choices he'd made. How could he be so naive? He never voted, apparently, after the war. He just said, "I'm not going to do politics. That's not me. I'm out of it." And when people say, well, how could he have gone on spying for the Russians after the war? Well, I think what he did after the war was generally helping his friend Guy Burgess, who was his sort of the person he was infatuated with at Cambridge and who was the one who persuaded him to sign up.
So one more question here from Peter Canale. Please forgive my pronunciation of your surname. He says, I read recently Patrick Sell's book about Philby and yours with all the new research you have done. It seems that you seems to agree with Sell's general approach and findings, or Seal. Any thoughts on Seal and the Philbys?
On Seal and the Philbys, well, on his book, on Seal's book on Philby. Yeah, I think it's terrific. I mean, I was a big fan of Philip Knightley, who did the last interview, well, a very late interview with Philby. But Patrick Seal's book I think is extraordinarily good, and I was fortunate enough to see the notes he took from his meetings with Eleanor, and he did an extraordinary amount of work, and it's really well woven together, I think. I mean, I would strongly recommend anyone who's interested in this to read it. There's a lot of stuff.
You're very generous about mentioning other people's books, and add all these to the canon of of the study of Philby, and yours is certainly one of them to be read. And particularly right now, I love this aspect of it, this sort of, I guess, humanizing, I suppose, of Philby, which shows him to be a rather complex character, as we all knew he was. But this whole telling about his love life and his appetite for women, I suppose, as a distraction maybe, but again, leaving so many women in his wake, in particular Eleanor. And as you say, I think that if she had been able to make do in Moscow, they could have perhaps had a life together forever.
Yeah. I mean, I know exactly what you're saying about Eleanor, but Aileen's story also, the wife he left behind in England.
Yeah.
That, as you mentioned, his treatment of her was appalling, and
but not only
people who believe he I mean, there are people who believe he actually killed her himself, and other people who say, well, he tried to drive her to suicide.
Yeah. Well, he may as well have killed her. I mean, she was the one also who said, she knew that he was a spy, and people sort of discounted her opinion. And she's like, no, you must understand, he's a spy, and nobody believed her because she was the mad woman, right?
Yeah, exactly. He portrayed her. I mean, he sort of, he slightly enjoyed that portrayal of her as this mad woman, as you say. Whereas and previously she'd been everyone says terrific company, amusing, so on and so on.
Well, look, James, I'm going to wrap up. We're just about an hour now, and I know everyone wants to have a drink and supper and all this drinking, and goings on in the St. George's, I was making me reach for, G&T at least. But everybody, I recommend this really highly. Love and Deception, Philby in Beirut, highly praised. And we've got a sheet full of quotes from the publicity department of people who are really loving this book, including Simon Cooper from the FT, George Carey, BBC producer of The Spy Who Went into the Cold, Richard Frost, Mark Elliott, son of Philby's MI6 colleague, Rachel Trethewey, Michael Holzman, Stephen Dorrell, Amanda Foreman, Andrew Lowney, who's the biographer of Guy Burgess, and Charlie Glass. I mean, so it's not, I'm not the only one who thinks this is a great book, and I recommend it really highly as a gift for Christmas, or for holiday reading. Yeah, it's fascinating, a fascinating snapshot of history and of a very complicated man. Thank you, James, so much for joining us. Now, I'm going to say to everybody, thank you for joining us. Please come again. Our next event will be on the 18th of November. I think, Pranvera, please correct me if I'm wrong. Just check Pranvera's website to discuss Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. A really shocking book. And of course, everybody knows Christina, and it's, again, another highly praised book that I can't wait to discuss with you, despite the harrowing stories that are told. That's all very important. James, again, thank you so much. It's a really pleasure to meet you virtually.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's been terrific. Thank you.
You too.